Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're going to explore a life that was lived by thousands of people in Tudor England, yet rarely gets discussed in detail. Not the life of a king or queen, not even a merchant or craftsperson. Tonight we're talking about servants, the people who made up the invisible workforce that kept Tudor households running. Before we start, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like and subscribe if you'd like. No obligation, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. It is always nice to know who is joining us. Now get comfortable, adjust your pillow, settle in under your blanket. Tonight we're going to move slowly through a day in the life of a Tudor servant. We'll start in the dark hours before dawn and work our way through every mundane task that filled their days. The emptying of chamber pots, the hauling of water, the sweeping of floors, the endless repetitive work that no one really thought about unless it wasn't done. This won't be exciting, but that is rather the point, because for most people throughout history, life wasn't exciting. It was work, day after day, doing the same necessary tasks that kept households functioning. So let's ease into that world together, slowly and quietly, and understand what it really meant to be a servant in Tudor England. The day began in darkness. Not the comforting darkness of being tucked into bed, but the cold, disorienting darkness of having to leave that bed far earlier than your body wanted. Most servants in Tudor households slept in shared rooms, often in attics or small chambers tucked away in less desirable parts of the house. The servants' quarters were not designed for comfort. They were designed to be functional and to use space that couldn't be used for anything more important. You might share a room with 3 or 4 other servants, all sleeping in narrow beds or even on pallets on the floor. The room would be cold, especially in winter, because heat was expensive and not wasted on servants' quarters. You'd sleep in your underclothes because you couldn't afford separate nightclothes, and because the extra layer helped with the cold. Somewhere around 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on the season and the household, someone would come to wake you, perhaps the head servant, perhaps whoever had been assigned wake up duty that week. A knock on the door, or a shake of your shoulder if they had to enter the room. No gentleness, no gradual waking. You were needed, so you got up. There was no time for lying in bed gathering your thoughts or slowly coming to consciousness. You rose immediately in the dark, feeling around for your clothes. Your work clothes which you'd worn yesterday and would wear again today and tomorrow, and the day after that until they needed washing or fell apart. Dressing happened quickly and mostly by feel. The fire in the servants' quarters, if there had been one, would have gone out during the night, so you dressed in the cold and the dark, your fingers clumsy with sleep and chill. Stockings, stays or doublet, depending on your gender, your work dress or work clothes. Nothing fancy, nothing that would matter if it got dirty or damaged during the day's work. You might splash some water on your face if there was water available in the room, though often there wasn't. More likely you'd simply rub your face with your hands, trying to wake yourself more fully. Your hair needed to be dealt with. For women, this meant braiding it or pinning it back tightly so it wouldn't get in the way. For men, combing it back as best you could. Appearance mattered, but only to the extent that you looked neat and tidy enough not to offend your employers. Then you made your way downstairs or to wherever your first duties were. Navigating the house in pre-dawn darkness, moving quietly so as not to wake the family or any guests. The household would wake later at a civilized hour, but the work that made that civilized waking possible had to be done first, in the dark, by people who weren't supposed to be seen or heard. Your stomach might be empty. Breakfast for servants came later, if at all, and certainly not before the family's needs were met. So you started the day hungry, cold, and not fully awake, because that was simply how it was. And as you began your work, you knew that this same routine would repeat tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for years, probably perhaps for your entire working life. The same early waking, the same cold darkness, the same immediate transition from sleep to labour. This was the beginning, not dramatic, not interesting, just the quiet, uncomfortable start to another day of work. Let's begin with perhaps the least glamorous but most necessary task. The chamber pots needed to be emptied every single morning without fail, and this job typically fell to the lower-ranking servants. Chamber pots were used by everyone in the household during the night. These were ceramic or metal pots kept in bedrooms so people didn't have to venture outside or to a privy in the dark. Every room had at least one. The master and mistress's room, the children's rooms if they were old enough to have separate chambers, guest rooms if there were visitors. All of these pots needed to be dealt with. You'd start with the family's chambers, the master and mistress's room first, because their needs took precedence over everyone else's. You'd enter quietly, trying not to wake them if they were still sleeping, though by this time they might be stirring. The chamber pot would be tucked under the bed or in a close stool, which was essentially a chair with a hole in the seat and a pot underneath. You'd carefully remove the pot. It would be heavy if it had been used multiple times during the night, and you had to be careful not to slosh the contents. One spill and you'd have a much bigger cleaning job, plus the displeasure of your employers to deal with. Carrying the pot, you'd make your way out of the room, moving carefully. Then on to the next chamber and the next, collecting all the pots that needed emptying. If you were efficient, you might carry 2 at a time, though this required balance and care. The destination was either the privy, if the house had one, or a designated area outside where waste could be dumped. In townhouses, this might be a cesspit in the yard. In rural houses, it might be farther from the building. Wherever it was, you made your way there, carrying pots full of urine and feces, trying not to think too much about what you were doing. The pots had to be emptied completely, tipped upside down to make sure nothing was left stuck in the bottom. Then they needed to be rinsed, at least briefly, though thorough cleaning might wait for later in the day. A quick rinse with water, a wipe with a rag, and the pot was ready to be returned. Then the whole process in reverse, carrying the empty, slightly damp pots back through the house, returning each one to its proper room, placing it back under the bed or in the close stool, making sure everything looked as it should, that there were no obvious signs that waste had just been removed from this room. The smell was unavoidable. Even when the pots were emptied promptly each morning, there was an odour. Your hands would smell despite rinsing them. Your clothes would pick up the scent. You became somewhat blind to it, simply because you dealt with it every single day. This task took perhaps half an hour to an hour, depending on the size of the household, and it had to be done first thing before the family was fully up and about, before anyone needed to use those facilities again. It was urgent, unglamorous, and absolutely necessary. No one thanked you for doing this work, it was simply expected. The chamber pots would be empty and clean when needed, and that was that. The fact that a human being had to handle waste to make that happen was not something polite people discussed or acknowledged. But you knew, every morning, handling those pots, dealing with the waste of people who barely noticed your existence. You knew exactly what your place in the household was. You were the person who did the things that needed doing, but that no one wanted to think about. And tomorrow morning, you'd do it again. With the chamber pots dealt with, the next essential task was fires. Every room in use needed a fire, and these fires didn't light themselves. This was another job that had to be done early, before the family needed the warmth and light that fires provided. You'd start in the main hall or parlour, the public rooms where the family would spend their day. The fireplace would still contain yesterday's ashes, cold and grey. These needed to be cleared out first, carefully, so as not to raise too much dust. You'd kneel before the fireplace, often getting your clothes dirty in the process. Using a small shovel or your hands, you'd scoop out the old ashes into a bucket or basket. Some of these ashes would be saved for various household uses, lye making for instance, or spreading on icy paths. The rest would be disposed of later. Once the fireplace was clear, you'd lay a new fire. This required some skill, actually. You couldn't just pile wood in and hope for the best. The fire needed to catch and burn efficiently. First, you'd arrange tinder. This might be dry straw, wood shavings, or specially prepared fire. Starting material. Then small kindling pieces on top of that, arranged so air could circulate. Then larger pieces of wood, but not so large they'd smother the smaller flames. Getting the fire lit was the tricky part. If the household was wealthy enough, there might be a tinderbox with flint and steel. You'd strike the flint against the steel, creating sparks that would hopefully catch on the char cloth in the box. Once you had a glowing ember, you'd carefully transfer it to your tinder, blowing gently to encourage flames. If there was no tinderbox, you might carry a coal or ember from the kitchen fire, which was kept burning through the night. Rushing through the house with a small container of hot coals, trying not to let it go out before you reached your destination. Once the fire caught, you'd have to watch it for a few minutes to make sure it was truly going. Feed it more kindling if needed. Adjust the wood to ensure good airflow. Only when you were confident the fire would continue burning could you move on to the next fireplace. And there were always multiple fireplaces. The hall, the parlour, the dining room, the master's chamber, possibly other bedrooms. Each one needed this same process. Clear ashes, lay fire, light it, tend it until it was burning well. In winter, this could take an hour or more. Your knees would hurt from kneeling. Your hands would be dirty from ash and wood. Your eyes might water from smoke, especially if a fireplace wasn't drawing well, and you'd be working quickly because the family would want these rooms warm by the time they came downstairs. There was also the constant risk of things going wrong, a fire that wouldn't catch, A chimney that suddenly decided to smoke into the room rather than draw properly. A spark that jumped onto the floor and needed to be quickly stamped out. These problems were your responsibility to solve, and quickly before anyone important was inconvenienced. Once all the fires were lit and burning properly, you'd need to bring in extra wood and stack it nearby for maintaining the fires throughout the day. Multiple armloads of wood carried from wherever the household's wood supply was kept. More carrying, more work, and all of this before breakfast, before the family stirred from their beds, because they needed to wake to warm rooms, and the mechanism that made those rooms warm was you, on your knees, coaxing fire from cold ashes. The warmth you created wasn't for you. The servants' quarters remained cold, but the family would be comfortable, and that was what mattered. Water. Everything in a Tudor household required water. Cooking, cleaning, washing, drinking, and all of that water had to be fetched and carried by servants. If the household was fortunate, there would be a well in the courtyard or a nearby public well. If less fortunate, water had to be carried from a river or stream. Either way, someone had to go get it, and that someone was usually a lower-ranking servant. You'd take buckets or large jugs, as many as you could reasonably carry. The walk to the water source might be just across the courtyard, or it might be several streets away if you were in a town and relied on a public conduit or fountain. Filling the containers was straightforward. If it was a well, you'd lower the bucket on a rope, let it fill, haul it up. This was harder than it sounds, especially if the well was deep. The rope would be rough on your hands. The full bucket would be heavy, requiring steady pulling to bring it up without spilling or dropping it back down. If water came from a river, you'd simply dip your containers in, though you had to be careful where you drew from. Too close to where people washed clothes or animals drank, and the water would be questionable. You learned the good spots where the water was cleanest. Then came the carrying. A full bucket of water is heavy, very heavy. Approximately 8 pounds per gallon, and a good-sized bucket might hold 3 gallons. That is 24 pounds, and you'd be carrying 2 buckets, one in each hand for balance. Nearly 50 pounds of water, held at arm's length, carried however far you needed to go. Your shoulders would ache, your arms would burn, your hands would cramp from gripping the bucket handles, but you kept moving because stopping just made it harder to start again, and one trip was never enough. The household needed large quantities of water. The kitchen needed water for cooking and washing dishes. Water was needed for washing floors and other cleaning. The family wanted water for washing hands and faces. If it was laundry day, the amount of water needed multiplied dramatically. So you made multiple trips, back and forth, fill buckets, carry them home, empty them into large storage vessels, return for more. This could take an hour or more, depending on how far you had to go and how much water was needed. In winter, the work was even harder. Ice had to be broken on the well or the river before you could draw water. Your wet hands would go numb from cold. The bucket's metal handles would be painfully cold to grip. In summer, at least your hands stayed warm, but the heat made the carrying more exhausting. You'd be sweating and thirsty, surrounded by water you were carrying for others. And there was no mechanization, no pumps to make this easier. Just human muscle, human endurance, human effort. Trip after trip, day after day, because the household needed water, and you were the mechanism by which water arrived where it was needed. Sometimes you'd see other servants doing the same work, a moment of shared acknowledgement, a brief nod or greeting. You were all doing the same thing, after all, carrying the essential resource that made household life possible, but mostly you just focused on the work itself. Lift, carry, walk, empty, return, repeat. Don't think about how many more trips you need to make. Don't think about how your shoulders ache. Just do it because it needs doing, and it won't do itself. Eventually, the household's immediate water needs would be met. The large vessels in the kitchen would be full. The pitchers in the family's chambers would be filled. You could move on to other tasks, at least until later in the day when water would be needed again. Your arms would be tired, your back would ache. But the water was there, available for whatever the household needed. And tomorrow, you'd fetch it all again, now that the basic necessities were handled. Chamber pots emptied, fires lit, water fetched, attention turned to food. The family would want breakfast, and breakfast didn't prepare itself. In wealthy households, there would be a dedicated cook and kitchen staff. In more modest households, senior servants or even the housewife herself might do the cooking. But regardless, lower servants were involved in the preparation and service. The kitchen would be starting to come alive. The fire that had been banked overnight would be built up into a proper cooking fire. Additional wood would be added. The heat increased. You might be assigned to keep the fire going, adding fuel as needed, making sure it burned hot and steady. Breakfast in a Tudor household varied by wealth and status. Wealthy families might have bread, butter, cold meats, cheese, ale or beer, perhaps some fruit. Poorer households would make do with bread, pottage, a thick porridge, ale. If bread was being baked that morning, which happened regularly since bread went stale quickly, the kitchen would be hot and busy. Dough that had been rising overnight would be shaped into loaves and put into the oven. The oven, heated by fire, needed constant attention to maintain the right temperature. You might be tasked with any number of things: bringing more wood for the fire, fetching additional water, cutting bread into slices, setting out plates and cups, preparing the ale, which might involve going to the cellar to draw it from barrels. The work was constant motion, back and forth between kitchen and hall, carrying items to where they were needed, following instructions from the cook or head servant. Don't drop anything. Don't spill anything. Move quickly but carefully. The family's breakfast would be set out in the hall or dining room. Bread arranged on plates, meat sliced and presented, butter and cheese set out, ale poured into cups. Everything had to look appealing, the table properly laid. Meanwhile, the servant's breakfast, if there was one, would be much simpler. Perhaps some bread and ale, eaten quickly in the kitchen while standing or sitting on whatever surface was available. No ceremony, no leisure, just food consumed as fuel while you continued working. You'd eat fast, knowing there were other tasks waiting. The food would be basic leftovers or the plainest provisions. But it was something, and you were hungry after hours of work, so you ate it gratefully. Then immediately back to work. Clear away the servant's simple meal. Continue assisting with food preparation if there was more cooking to be done for later meals. Clean up the early morning's work. Wipe down surfaces. Put away items that had been used. The breakfast service for the family required careful attention. You'd bring food to the table as needed, refill cups, remove empty plates, all done quietly, efficiently and visibly. You were not supposed to draw attention to yourself. You were simply there to ensure the family's needs were met. If something went wrong, a plate dropped, ale spilled, food served cold, there would be consequences. At minimum, sharp words, possibly more severe punishment depending on the household and the severity of the error. So you moved carefully, paid attention, made sure everything was as it should be. The family ate, talked, started their day, and you facilitated that, invisibly, one small task at a time. Once breakfast was finished, the clearing began. Plates and cups collected and carried to the kitchen. Food remaining on the table removed and stored or distributed to servants. The table wiped down, benches pushed back into place. The dishes then needed washing. In a time before running water or dishwashers, this meant heating water, scrubbing each plate and cup by hand, rinsing them, drying them, putting them away. More hot water, more physical labour, all of this before mid-morning. And the day was only just beginning. With breakfast dealt with, attention turned to cleaning the family's bedchambers. These rooms needed to be cleaned while the family was elsewhere, usually having breakfast or beginning their daily activities. You'd enter the master's chamber first, moving quietly even though the room was now empty. The bed was the focal point. Tudor beds for wealthy families were substantial pieces of furniture, with curtains, coverings, and multiple layers of bedding. The first task was airing the bed. The curtains would be pulled back fully if they weren't already. The coverlets and blankets would be pulled back to expose the sheets. Windows would be opened, if weather permitted, to let fresh air circulate. The theory was that airing the bed kept it fresh and healthy. While the bed aired, you'd turn to other tasks. The floor needed sweeping. Tudor floors might be stone, wood, or packed earth, depending on the room and the household's wealth. Whatever the surface, it collected dust, rushes if the floor was covered with them, and various debris. You'd take a broom, a simple bundle of twigs tied to a handle, and sweep the floor methodically. Start at the far end of the room, work your way toward the door, gathering all the dust and debris. This had to be done thoroughly, but not slowly. You had other rooms to clean. The swept debris would be gathered and removed. If the floor had rushes scattered on it, which was common, you'd need to check their condition. Rushes absorbed moisture and odours, but they also got dirty and crushed. If they were too soiled, they'd need to be gathered up and replaced with fresh ones. Surfaces needed dusting. Furniture, windowsills, the bed frame itself. You'd use a cloth, going over each surface, removing the dust that accumulated constantly in a time before sealed windows and modern ventilation. The chamber pot, which you'd emptied earlier, might need more thorough cleaning now. If so, you'd take it to be scrubbed properly, removing any residue, making sure it was clean for the night's use. Once the bed had aired sufficiently, it needed to be made. This wasn't like making a modern bed. Tudor beds were complex. Sheets needed to be straightened and tucked. Multiple layers of blankets or coverlets needed to be arranged. Pillows needed to be plumped and positioned. The bed curtains needed to be arranged properly, pulled back decoratively during the day. Everything had to look perfect. Smooth, neat, without wrinkles or disorder. If the family or an important guest saw the bed and found it unsatisfactory, you'd have to redo it. Then on to the next chamber, the mistress's chamber if she had a separate one. The children's rooms, each one needed the same attention. Sweep, dust, air the bed, make the bed, check that everything was in order. If there were guests staying in the house, their rooms required extra care. Guests reflected on the household's hospitality and standards. Their chambers had to be impeccable. This cleaning took most of the morning, room after room, the same tasks repeated. Your back would hurt from bending to make beds and sweep floors. Your arms would tire from the constant movement. But the work had to be done, and done well. You'd also be checking for things that needed repair or attention. A torn bed curtain that needed mending. A window that wasn't closing properly. Any issues would be reported to the appropriate person, usually the head servant, who would ensure they were dealt with. Throughout this work, you might encounter family members. If so, you'd make yourself small, work around them, acknowledge them respectfully, but briefly. You were there to serve, not to socialize. By the time you finished cleaning the chambers, it would be approaching midday. The rooms would be clean, beds made, everything in order, ready for the family to use them again, to mess them up again, so you could clean them again tomorrow. The repetitive nature of the work was inescapable. Every day, the same rooms needed the same attention. Nothing stayed clean, nothing stayed organized. The work was never truly done, only temporarily completed until it needed doing again. Not every day was laundry day, but when it came around, it dominated everything. Laundry was perhaps the most physically demanding regular task in a Tudor household, and servants dreaded it. Laundry day might happen once a week, once every 2 weeks, or monthly, depending on the household's size and wealth. The work couldn't be avoided, only delayed. Clothes got dirty, linens needed washing. Eventually it all had to be dealt with. The first step was gathering all the dirty laundry, soiled clothing from the family and the servants, bed linens that had been in use for weeks, table linens stained from meals, kitchen cloths greasy from cooking. All of this would be collected in large baskets. The sheer volume was daunting. A large household might generate dozens of items needing washing. Each one would require individual attention at some point in the process. Massive amounts of water, had to be fetched and heated. This meant countless trips to the well and hours spent keeping fires hot enough to heat the large wash cauldrons. You'd be carrying water all morning, your arms aching, knowing you'd need even more water for rinsing later. The washing happened in large wooden tubs or directly in the heated cauldrons. Lye soap, harsh and effective, would be added to the hot water. The smell was unpleasant, a combination of hot water, lye, and dirty laundry. The actual washing required physical strength. Items would be immersed in the hot soapy water, then scrubbed vigorously. Some households had washboards for this purpose. Others simply used their hands and a lot of effort. You'd be bent over the wash tub for hours. Your hands would be in hot water, made harsher by the lye, which would dry and crack your skin. The repetitive scrubbing motion would make your arms and shoulders ache. Steam would make your face hot and flushed. Stains required special attention. Blood had to be soaked in cold water first. Grease might need additional treatment. Difficult stains meant more scrubbing, more time spent on a single item. After washing came rinsing. Multiple rinses in clean water to remove all the soap. This meant more water had to be fetched, more heating, more manual labor. You'd wring out each item between rinses, twisting the fabric to squeeze out the water. This was hard on your hands and wrists, especially with heavy items like sheets. Once everything was washed and rinsed, it had to be wrung out as thoroughly as possible. 2 people might work together on large items, each twisting from opposite ends. The goal was to remove as much water as possible before drying. Then came the hanging. All the wet laundry had to be hung somewhere to dry. In good weather, this might be outside on lines or bushes. In bad weather, items would be hung inside, draped over furniture, or lines strung across rooms. Hanging the laundry meant more carrying. Baskets of wet, heavy items transported to wherever they'd be dried. Each piece had to be hung properly to ensure it dried evenly and without excessive wrinkling. The drying could take hours or days depending on the weather. During this time, you'd check periodically, feeling items to see if they were dry, moving them if needed. Once dry, the laundry had to be collected, folded, and stored. Some items might need pressing with a hot iron to smooth wrinkles. This added another layer of work, heating the irons in the fire, pressing each item carefully to avoid scorching. A laundry day could easily consume from sunrise to well past sunset. Every servant would be involved in some capacity. The work was endless, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. And the worst part, knowing you'd have to do it all again in a week or two, the laundry never stopped accumulating. The work was never truly finished. While some servants continued with their various tasks, others turned their attention to the midday meal. This was typically the main meal of the day in Tudor times, eaten around noon or early afternoon. The process began in the kitchen, where the cook and kitchen servants had been preparing food for hours. Multiple dishes would be made for a prosperous household: meat, vegetables, bread, perhaps a pudding or tart. Your role might involve any number of tasks: bringing firewood to keep the kitchen fire burning hot, fetching ingredients from storage areas, washing vegetables, preparing the serving platters and dishes. The dining hall had to be set up. The table needed to be covered with a cloth, often a plain one for everyday meals, but potentially nicer linens for special occasions. Places needed to be set with plates, cups, cutlery, napkins. This setup had to follow specific patterns. The master's place at the head of the table properly arranged, other family members in their appropriate positions, any guests placed according to their status. Getting this wrong could be socially awkward for the family. Salt cellars, which were important indicators of status, needed to be placed correctly. The most important people sat above the salt, near the more ornate and valuable salt cellar. Less important people sat below it. Serving the meal required coordination and attention. Dishes would be brought from the kitchen and presented to the family. Meat would be carved, often by a servant specifically skilled in this task. Bread would be sliced. Ale or wine would be poured. You'd serve from the correct side, moving around the table in the proper order. Serve the most important people first, then work your way down the hierarchy. Never reach across someone. Never let your sleeve drag in the food. Never spill anything. Throughout the meal, you'd stand ready to refill cups. Bring additional food if requested. Remove empty plates. You were present but not intrusive, attentive but not hovering. It was a balance that took practice to achieve. The family would eat, talk, enjoy their meal. You would stand there hungry, having eaten only a brief breakfast hours ago. The smells of the food would be tantalizing, but none of it was for you. Not yet, anyway. Servants typically ate after the family finished consuming the leftovers. Sometimes these were quite good, the same quality food the family had eaten, just less of it. Other times the family ate everything, and servants made do with bread and whatever scraps remained. Your meal, when it came, would be eaten quickly, standing or sitting wherever you could find space in the kitchen. No ceremony, no leisure, no conversation really. Just food consumed fast so you could get back to work. After the family's meal was finished, the clearing and cleaning began. All the plates, cups, and cutlery had to be collected and taken to the kitchen. The tablecloth had to be shaken out and folded, or sent for washing if it was soiled. The table itself had to be wiped clean. The dishes required washing, in hot water, scrubbing each one clean. Pots and pans from cooking also needed washing, and these were often crusted with burnt food that required serious scrubbing. Your hands would be red and raw from the hot water and the constant work. Everything had to be dried and put away in its proper place. The kitchen needed to be tidied. Food that would keep had to be covered and stored. Scraps might be saved for animals or given to the poor who came to the door. This entire process, preparation, service, eating, clean-up, took several hours. And by the time it was finished, you'd need to start thinking about the evening meal, which would require much of the same work all over again. The cycle of meals was unending. 3 times a day, every day, food had to be prepared, served, and cleaned up after. And servants were involved in every stage of the process. The afternoon brought its own set of tasks, though the specific duties varied depending on the household and the day of the week. Maintenance work was constant. Floors that had been swept in the morning needed sweeping again by afternoon, especially in high-traffic areas. Dust accumulated quickly, and cleanliness was important to the family's reputation. You might be sent on errands, perhaps to the market to purchase something the cook needed, perhaps to deliver a message to someone in another household, perhaps to fetch something from a shop or a neighbour. These errands were a mixed blessing. On one hand, they got you out of the house and provided some variety to the day. On the other hand, they had to be completed quickly and efficiently, and any delay or error would be your fault. Walking through Tudor streets was its own experience. Narrow lanes, often muddy or filled with refuse. People and animals everywhere. You'd have to navigate carefully, avoid trouble, complete your errand, and return promptly. Back at the house, other work continued. Mending was a constant need. Clothes developed tears, buttons came off, seams split. Someone had to repair these things, and that someone was usually a servant with sewing skills. You might spend an afternoon sitting in a corner somewhere, needle and thread in hand, working your way through a pile of items that needed mending. This was quieter work than most, almost restful, in comparison to the physical labor of the morning. But your fingers would prick from the needle, your eyes would strain from the fine work, and the pile never seemed to get smaller. Polishing was another regular task. Any metal items in the household, candlesticks, serving platters, decorative objects, needed regular polishing to keep them shiny. You'd use a cloth and polishing compound, rubbing each item until it gleamed. This was tedious work, the same motion over and over, working on a single object until it met standards, then moving to the next one. Your arms would tire from the circular polishing motion. In larger households, there might be specialized afternoon tasks. Perhaps you'd assist with childcare if there were young children in the family. This might seem easier than physical labor, but children required constant attention and could be demanding. Or you might help in the garden if the household had one. Weeding, watering, harvesting vegetables or herbs. This was seasonal work, but when it needed doing, servants were the ones doing it. Preparing for the evening also occupied the afternoon. Fires that had been lit in the morning needed tending, adding wood, adjusting logs, clearing away ash that had built up. Fresh water needed to be fetched for evening washing and cooking. Candles needed to be placed throughout the house in anticipation of darkness. These would be lit later, but the afternoon was when you'd make sure each room had the candles it would need. In wealthy households, this might include expensive beeswax candles for the family. Cheaper tallow candles would be used in areas where servants worked. Throughout all of this, you were on call. If the family needed anything, a fire adjusted, a window opened, a message delivered, an item fetched. You stopped what you were doing and responded immediately. Your own tasks had to be fit around the family's needs. The afternoon wore on. Your fatigue from the early morning start was catching up with you. Your feet hurt from standing and walking all day. Your back ached, your hands were sore, but the day wasn't over. Evening was coming with its own set of duties. As the day began to fade, attention turned once again to food. The evening meal, or supper, needed to be prepared and served. This was typically a lighter meal than the midday one, but it still required work. The cook would be preparing dishes. The kitchen fire, which had been kept going all day, would be built up again for cooking. You'd fall back into the familiar rhythm, fetching items from storage, preparing vegetables, setting up the dining hall. The same tasks as midday, repeated with slight variations. The table would be laid again, plates, cups, cutlery arranged. The family would gather as the light faded outside, and candles were lit to provide illumination. Serving the meal followed the same protocol as earlier. Present dishes properly. Pour drinks carefully. Stand ready to assist. Watch for any need and respond immediately. The evening meal often had a different atmosphere than the midday one. The family might be more relaxed, the day's work behind them. They might linger longer at the table, talking, enjoying the evening. For you, this meant standing longer, waiting longer, staying attentive longer. Your feet would ache. You'd be tired, but you maintained your composure, your readiness to serve. Eventually the meal would conclude. The family would move to another room for the evening, perhaps to sit by the fire, to read, to engage in conversation or games, and you would clear the table again, carry dishes to the kitchen again, wash everything again. The repetition of the work was almost dreamlike in its predictability. The evening cleanup seemed to take longer than the midday one, perhaps because you were more tired, perhaps because darkness had fallen and working by candlelight made everything more difficult. But the work got done because it had to. Dishes washed and put away, kitchen cleaned, food covered and stored, everything made ready for tomorrow's beginning of the cycle all over again. As the evening progressed and the family prepared for bed, servants had a final round of duties. Fires in the bedchambers needed attention. If they'd burned low during the day, they'd be built up again for the night. The family wanted warm rooms to sleep in, at least in the early part of the night. Warming pans were common in wealthier households. These were metal pans, usually copper, with long handles. Hot coals would be placed inside, and the pan would be run between the sheets of the bed to warm them before the family got in. You'd prepare these warming pans, being careful not to leave them too long in any spot, or they'd scorch the sheets. Move them back and forth, warming the bed, then remove them before the family retired. The chamber pots, which had been cleaned and returned this morning, needed to be checked to ensure they were in place and ready for the night. Water pitchers needed to be filled for washing. Candles needed to be lit or replaced. If the family needed assistance undressing, senior servants would provide it. Lower servants might be called to fetch items, move furniture, or handle any other small tasks that arose. Throughout these evening preparations, you'd move quietly, respectfully. The day was ending for the family. They were tired and wanted rest. Your presence should be as unobtrusive as possible. Once the family was settled for the night, you'd make your final rounds. Bank the fires in common rooms so they wouldn't go out completely but wouldn't burn through too much fuel. Secure doors and windows. Make sure candles were extinguished, except where they were needed for safety. The house would grow quieter as the evening turned to night. The family slept. The day's activity faded, but your work wasn't quite finished. There might be a brief period where servants could gather, perhaps in the kitchen, to eat any remaining food from supper, to talk quietly among themselves. This was your social time, the only real break in the day where you could relax slightly. But it was brief. You were exhausted. The day had started in darkness before dawn and was ending in darkness well after sunset. You'd been working for 16 hours or more, with only brief breaks for meagre meals. Eventually you'd make your way to your sleeping quarters, back up to the attic or wherever servants slept. In the dark you'd remove your work clothes, too tired to care much about changing into anything else. You'd crawl into your narrow bed or onto your pallet. Your body would ache all over, your feet would throb, your hands would be sore. But sleep would come quickly, because you were simply too exhausted to resist it. And you'd sleep knowing that in just a few hours, someone would wake you again. The chamber pots would need emptying. The fires would need lighting. The water would need fetching. Tomorrow would be another day just like today. And the day after would be the same. And the day after that. This was your life. This was what being a servant meant. Not every day was exactly the same, of course. There were variations and special occasions that broke the routine, though they often just meant different work rather than less work. When the household had guests, everything intensified. Guest chambers had to be prepared with extra care, more food had to be prepared and served. The standards for cleanliness and service went even higher because the household's reputation was being judged. You'd work harder, longer, with more stress. Any error in front of guests would reflect poorly on the family and would likely result in serious consequences for you. Religious feast days and holidays brought their own disruptions. Christmas, Easter, and other important dates meant special meals, church attendance, and sometimes even a bit of celebration that included servants. But these celebrations usually meant extra work first. Special foods had to be prepared. The house had to be cleaned even more thoroughly than usual. Everything had to be perfect. If you were lucky, you might get a few hours off or a special meal on the actual feast day. But this time off would be paid for with extra work before and after the holiday. Sundays theoretically included church attendance and some rest. But in reality, the basic work of the household still needed doing. Chamber pots didn't empty themselves on Sundays. Fires still needed tending. Meals still needed preparing. You might get to go to church if the household attended and brought their servants. This was a break in the routine, a chance to sit down for a while and hear a service. Though, if you were tired enough, staying awake during the sermon could be a challenge. Market days brought different tasks. Perhaps you'd be sent to accompany the cook to help carry purchases. This meant walking to market, waiting while shopping was done, carrying heavy baskets back to the house. The market was bustling and interesting, a change from the confines of the household. But it was still work, still carrying, still walking, still being on duty. Laundry days, which we discussed earlier, were their own kind of special occasion special, in that they were particularly dreaded and exhausting. Moving days, if the household relocated seasonally or moved residences, were chaos. Everything had to be packed, transported, unpacked, and set up in the new location. Days of heavy labour, carrying and organising, working in unfamiliar spaces. Illness in the household brought different demands. If a family member was sick, servants might be called on to help with nursing care, fetching things for the sick person, changing bedding more frequently, preparing special foods, running errands for medicine or doctors. If the illness was serious or contagious, there was also the fear of catching it yourself. But you couldn't refuse to help. Your job was to serve, and that included serving in sickness as well as health. Deaths were perhaps the most difficult variation. When someone in the household died, there would be periods of mourning. The body had to be prepared and laid out. Mourning cloths had to be hung, a funeral had to be arranged. Servants would be involved in all of this, dealing with death in very practical ways. Cleaning, preparing, serving, organising. Your own grief, if you had any, was secondary to the family's needs. But through all these variations, the core truth remained the same. You were a servant. Your role was to work, to serve, to make the household function. Whether it was an ordinary day or a special occasion, your place remained unchanged. It is important to understand that servants weren't all equal. There was a hierarchy below stairs just as there was above stairs, and your place in that hierarchy affected your experience significantly. At the top were the senior servants. In large households, this might include a steward who managed the household's affairs, a housekeeper who oversaw domestic operations, a cook who ruled the kitchen. These senior servants had real authority and relatively better conditions. They might have private rooms rather than shared quarters. They ate better food. They had some control over their time and work. They also had the power to make life easier or harder for the servants beneath them. A kind senior servant might be understanding when you made a mistake, offering guidance rather than punishment. A harsh one could make every day miserable, finding fault with everything, punishing ruthlessly for minor errors. Then came the middle ranks. Servants with specialized skills or longer tenure, perhaps a lady's maid who attended to the mistress's personal needs, a valet who served the master, skilled servants in the kitchen or stable. These servants had more respect and slightly better treatment than the lowest ranks. They might be consulted about household matters. They had some status, even if it was only status among other servants. At the bottom were the lowest servants, young, unskilled, or newly hired. These were the servants who did the hardest, dirtiest work, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, carrying water and wood. All the tasks no one else wanted to do. This was where most servants started. If you were lucky and showed aptitude, you might work your way up over years or decades, but many servants remained in the lower ranks their entire working lives. The hierarchy was reinforced in many ways. Where you slept with the worst quarters going to the lowest servants. What you ate with the best leftovers going to senior servants first. How you were addressed and treated by the family. Conflicts between servants were common. Competition for better positions, resentment between ranks. Personal disputes complicated by the stress of hard work and close quarters. Senior servants sometimes abused their authority, expecting deference and service from lower servants, in addition to what the family demanded. You might find yourself serving both the family and the senior servants, but there was also sometimes solidarity. Servants who recognized their shared position, who helped each other when possible, who commiserated about their work. These connections could make life more bearable. Gender affected the hierarchy too. Male servants generally held higher status than female servants doing similar work. A manservant might earn more and be treated with more respect than a female servant, even if her work was just as difficult. Age played a role as well. Younger servants were expected to defer to older ones. But age also brought physical decline, making it harder to do the demanding work, potentially leading to dismissal if you could no longer keep up. Understanding your place in this hierarchy was crucial. You had to know who to obey, who to defer to, who you might command if anyone. Getting this wrong could lead to conflicts that made your life even harder. And all of this was happening in a world where everyone, servants and family alike, was acutely aware of hierarchy and status. Your place was defined, fixed, visible, in everything from where you stood to what you wore, to how people spoke to you. Let's talk about what servants actually received for all this work, because it is important to understand the economic reality of service. Payment varied enormously depending on the household's wealth, the servant's position, and the time period. But for lower servants, the pay was minimal. You might receive a few pounds per year in cash, perhaps £2 or £3 annually for the lowest positions in the late Tudor period. This wasn't much. For context, a loaf of bread cost about a penny, so your yearly wage might buy you a few hundred loaves. But the wage wasn't the whole compensation. Room and board were provided, and for many servants, this was actually more valuable than the cash payment. You had a place to sleep and food to eat, which you wouldn't have to pay for. The quality of that room and board varied wildly. In a wealthy household with kind employers, you might sleep in a decent room and eat fairly well. In a poor household with harsh employers, your quarters might be barely adequate and your food meagre. Clothing was sometimes provided, at least work clothes. This was necessary because your work would destroy clothes quickly, but provided might mean hand-me-downs from the family or other servants, worn and patched, rather than new garments. Some households gave additional compensation at holidays, a gift at Christmas perhaps, a bonus payment, new clothes at Easter. These were welcome but unpredictable, dependent on the employer's generosity. What you weren't getting was security or benefits in any modern sense. There was no pension when you got old, no health insurance if you got sick, no paid time off for rest or recovery. If you couldn't work, you weren't paid. If you were dismissed, you had to leave immediately with whatever possessions you could carry. There was no severance, no notice period necessarily. Your employment could end at any time for any reason. If the family's fortunes declined, servants would be dismissed to save money. If you displeased your employers, you could be turned out. If you became too old or sick to work effectively, you'd be replaced. This insecurity was constant. You could be doing the same work in the same household for years and still have no guarantee of employment tomorrow. Finding a new position could be difficult. You needed references, which meant you couldn't afford to leave a position on bad terms or be dismissed for cause. Your reputation among other households mattered enormously. Many servants stayed in unsatisfactory positions because leaving without a good reference would make finding other work nearly impossible. You endured harsh treatment, long hours, and poor conditions because the alternative might be unemployment and poverty. For women, there were additional concerns. Female servants were vulnerable to sexual harassment or assault from male family members or other servants. Becoming pregnant could mean immediate dismissal with no support. The consequences of such situations fell entirely on the servant. Some servants did manage to save money over years of work. If you were frugal and lucky, you might accumulate a small sum that could fund a different life eventually. Perhaps enough to marry and set up a modest household. Perhaps enough to start a small business. But this required years of saving tiny amounts from already minimal wages. And any emergency, illness, having to help family, being robbed, could wipe out those savings immediately. The reality was that most servants lived on the edge of subsistence, working constantly just to maintain the bare minimum of food and shelter. Any improvement in circumstances required extraordinary luck, decades of perfect service or both. This was the economic foundation of service. You traded your labor, your time, your youth, and your health for minimal compensation and the constant risk of destitution. So what does the life of a Tudor servant tell us? What can we learn from these stories of chamber pots and fires and endless work? First, it reminds us that the comfortable lives of wealthy families were built on invisible labor. Every aspect of Tudor upper-class life, the clean houses, the regular meals, the warm fires, the clean clothes, all of this required human effort, servant effort. The historical records focus on the important people. We know what Henry VIII ate, what Elizabeth I wore, what various nobles and merchants did. But we know much less about the thousands of servants who made those lifestyles possible. Yet without servants, none of it would have functioned. The grand houses would have been cold and dirty. The elaborate meals would never have reached the table. The fine clothes would have remained unwashed. Second, it shows us that most people's lives throughout history have been defined by labor. Not exciting labor, not creative or fulfilling labor, just necessary work done day after day because it had to be done. The servant's experience wasn't unique in this regard. Most people in every era have spent most of their time working to survive, doing tasks that weren't meaningful or interesting, but were simply necessary. Third, it illustrates the vast inequality of pre-modern society. While wealthy families lived in comfort, the servants who provided that comfort lived in deprivation. The same house contained both luxury and hardship, separated by the social divide between masters and servants. This inequality wasn't seen as unjust by most people at the time. It was simply the way things were. Some people were born to comfort, others to labor. This was the order of society, ordained by God, unchangeable. But of course, it was changeable. Social structures that seemed permanent and naturally shifted. The specific form of household service common in the Tudor period eventually gave way to different labor arrangements, different social structures. Fourth, it reminds us of the physical cost of labor before modern technology. In a world without running water, someone had to carry every drop. In a world without electricity, someone had to tend every fire. In a world without plumbing, someone had to deal with human waste. We've mechanized or eliminated most of these tasks now, but for centuries they were done by human bodies, human backs, human hands. The progress we take for granted represents millions of people's labor over generations. Finally, perhaps most importantly, it tells us that unremarkable lives matter. The servant whose name we don't know, who emptied chamber pots and swept floors for 40 years and died without anyone recording their existence. That life mattered. That person experienced the full range of human emotions. They had hopes and dreams, relationships and losses, joys and sorrows. History tends to remember the remarkable, but most life has always been unremarkable. Most people have always been anonymous, doing work that no one thought worth recording, living lives that seemed insignificant to those who had the power to decide what was significant. But unremarkable doesn't mean unimportant. The servants' work kept society functioning. Their labour was essential, even when it was invisible. Tonight, we've spent time thinking about these unremarkable lives, about the cold mornings and the heavy buckets, about the aching backs and the dirty hands, about the endless repetition of necessary tasks. We've tried to see these servants not as background figures in someone else's story, but as people with their own experiences, their own challenges, their own humanity, and perhaps that is enough, to remember that they existed, to acknowledge that their work mattered, to recognise that history was made not just by the famous few, but by the millions of ordinary people doing ordinary work. The chamber pots were emptied, the fires were lit, the water was carried, the work was done. And somewhere in Tudor England a servant went to sleep exhausted, knowing they'd wake before dawn to do it all again. Good night, everyone. Rest well, and maybe, just maybe, appreciate a little more the conveniences of modern life that mean you don't have to empty chamber pots in the morning.